So, funny story. I was finishing up with my lunch break when I received a phone call from Miss Parentskies. And me mumsky was like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Well, I'm just finishing up with my lunch break." "Why?" And she was like, "Well, your dad and I are taking the boys for a ride, and we are actually on our way to go and pick up our to-go order from Machi's. And we will be at your house in about 3 minutes." And I was like, "What?" Mom's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Why?" And she's like, "Because I ordered you something." And I'm like, "Okay, well, what did you order me?" And she's like, "I ordered you your favorite, which is Patty's favorite." And I'm like, "Okay." And she's like, "What?" And I'm like, "Well, if you knew that you and Dad were going to be going to Machi's, I wish you would have called me so that I could decide what I wanted." And my mumsky is like, "If I would have called you, I know you would have said that you didn't want anything." I'm like, "Okay, that can be a true, valid statement." And she's like, "It is the only statement. If I would have called you, you would have said, 'No, I don't want anything.'" I'm like, "Maybe." And Mom was like, "No, that's what you would have said. And then you would have complained about how you don't have anything to eat, how empty your fridge is, and if you would have known that your dad and I went to lunch and didn't bring you anything, you would have gotten upset with us." I'm like, "Maybe, but I mean, come on." And so my momsky's like, "We are on our way and we are going to drop off your sandwich." And she's like, "So did you eat?" And I'm like, "Yes, I ate." She's like, "Okay, then you can have it for dinner." I'm like, "Okay." And so then, out of nowhere, and I mean out of nowhere, me momsky then is like, "Your dad and I have a serious question for you." And I was like, "Okay, what is it?" And me momsky is like, "Okay, if you would have decided to take the plunge and got married, whether it be after high school, while you're in college, or even shortly after college, how many times do you think you would have been divorced by now?" I was like, that's kind of a heavy way to end my lunch break. But I was like, in all honesty, probably 5. And my mom was like, I'm like, "What?" She's like, "I said 10. I'm like, "What?" And then my dad was like, "I said 8. I was like, "What?" I'm like, 8 or 10 times? I'm like, "Come on." I was like, "Come on, you guys. Give me a break. 5, sure. 8, 10? And then they were on speakerphone, and they were both like, "Well, you can be a lot." And I'm like, "What?" They're like, "Yeah, like, just take, for instance, our conversation just now about your order. Like, why not just say thank you?" I'm like, "Oh, I guess." And they're like, "Yeah." They're like, you're a lot. You can be a lot to handle." I'm like, "Maybe." And so then me momsky was like, well, okay, so then I was like, "But still, 8 or 10. And me momsky was like, "Well, I don't like odd numbers." I'm like, "That's true." I said, "If I had to choose, I guess between 5 or 10, I would go with 10 because that's my favorite number. So why not get the amount of divorces that matches my favorite number?" And then me momsky is like, "Well, realistically, at most, people should maybe get divorced twice. Maybe, depending upon the circumstances, 3 times and no more." And I was like, "Why?" And then my momsky's like, "First time, shame on him. Second time, shame on you. Third time, shame on the both of you." And I was like, "Okay." And I'm like, "But you see, I always view love as being something similar to the seasons that we go through. And my parents are like, what? I'm like, yeah. I'm like, love is like the seasons. It comes and it goes. So why just commit yourself to one or two or maybe 3 marriages? And you can fall in love and you can fall out of love just as easily. And then my momski was giving me a timeline of how she would think that my marriages and divorces would be. And I was like, okay, I get it. But yeah, so for those of you that have ever wondered why I've never gotten married, 1, I don't like commitment. I don't. And 2, I know I would have been divorced. I know I've gone through probably literally at least 3 to 5 divorces. So why not save myself the time and the money? But for those of you that have found your true one love, congratulations. It's just not me or for me.